So we know how to edge highlight our models, but how about layering? Nick speaking, and welcome to this video. Right, time for another back to basics video for you, and in this one I want to cover layering. So layering is another form of highlighting your models, so I really hope it is useful to you. As always, this is aimed for beginners, so let's have a look at layering. Okay, so let's have a chat about layering. This is another form of highlighting your model. Now, previously we talked about highlighting with a dry brushing. When you dry brush the model, it hits all the edges, looks pretty good. What tends to happen is the flat areas, dry brushing doesn't really work very well on. So then we looked at edge highlighting, which is particularly useful for Space Marines or anything that's got some edged armour like say Eldar or Dark Eldar. When you go in and you basically just draw a line on the edge of the armour and it gives you a nice highlight, and you don't have to actually touch any of the big flat areas. For example, on this Marine, on his shoulder pad, so we just basically edged in a little line around the top of the shoulder pad just to indicate the highlight. So the next stage to that, especially when you've got an area of model which doesn't actually have any raised sections, is to highlight using what we call layering. That's basically going in with a slightly lighter paint and adding a layer. So for example, if we were doing the top of this shoulder pad, going in the top of this shoulder pad with a slightly lighter yellow, and then maybe an even lighter yellow, and actually covering a bigger area of that shoulder pad. To the point that a more advanced technique to that would be to actually blend those colours together, so you can't actually see any hard edges from one transition of colour to the next one. We're not going to cover that in this particular video, but we are going to do, as I said, a little bit of layering. Now, first of all, before I actually move on and actually do some layering on the video, I want to bring in another model which hopefully will explain it a little bit more. Okay, so here is my Morlock for my Tyranid army. Now, I designed my Tyranid paint scheme specifically to make it nice and easy to paint. I wanted something fun, something that was easy to paint, and something that was quick to paint, because after all, Tyranids do have quite a high model count, especially with all the little gaunts and gamps. So I came up with this design of obviously the yellow and black, and what I did is I primarily used layering to highlight the yellow. So let me just zoom in a bit and just show you that. Now we're talking about, for example, this section here. So what I did is I laid down the snakebite leather exactly where I wanted the sort of yellowy finish to be. I then added some sunburst yellow to that mix, about a 50-50 mix, and I painted halfway up over the snakebite leather with that 50-50 mix. I then went in with a sunburst yellow and I just painted about a quarter of it. I then went in and added some white to that sunburst yellow, and I painted just the little edge just on the ends there. So about 4, possibly 5 different layers, just getting lighter and lighter and building up the highlight, and the end result actually looks pretty good. Now obviously, if you look close at this particular model, which like we are, of course you can see all those different layers. They're not blended together, but for a tabletop quality model, that's fine. So it's a nice easy way of getting the highlights down without having to stress about having to wet blend your models, for example, because wet blending does take time and practice. It's not a technique that you're going to be able to do straight away. Now we are going to talk about blending in another video, but just a point about blending is, although I've got this really nice simple paint scheme on this model in terms of layering, let me just bring the tel up and just show you that as well, because it's quite prominent on there. You can see all of those little layers just on there, but from a distance looks pretty good. Now what I was talking about just a second ago was, now to add to the fact that obviously I had layered most of the model, I wanted to take your eye away from the fact that I had layered that, and what I decided to do was anything that was a scything talon, which is, let's face it, most Tyranids have a scything talon on somewhere, I actually blended the colour. So the idea being that when you initially look at it, you see those big scything talons, they look really nicely blended. Let me just zoom in a bit on my talon. So yeah, there's the talons, and they're all, as I said, blended, exactly the same colours as everywhere else, but blended in. And it gives you that illusion that the whole model is basically like that, even though it's actually only on those sections. Also did it on the pointed sort of towel area as well, so that's blended through there. As I said, we're going to talk about blending in another video, but you can see what I'm talking about. So, you know, I've taken the time on some areas just to try and get the quality of the army up. Even though the whole army isn't necessarily painted to that particular standard. And indeed, you could take that to a different level. You could maybe have your HQ units, for example, painted up to, you know, a really high standard, and then maybe just have your gaunts and gants just painted up to a basic standard. Obviously, that's just all your personal preference. But the other thing that I wanted to just mention about layering, using this technique that I've been using here, is that the smaller the thing that you have to paint, the less obvious your layering technique is going to be. And that's why there are some areas of a model where basically the best option is to just do layers. And that's what I'm going to show you on our Space Marine. So on our Space Marine, we are going to paint this little eagle on the front of his chest plate, and it is quite a small little area, so we are literally just going to go in and add a few layers. So I'm going to set up the paints and everything, and then I'll be back and we'll have a go at painting it. Okay, so I've got my wet palettes. I've put on some Magnetising red, put a little bit of water in with it. I then put on this here, which is Wild Rider red, again a little bit of water. Then I mixed those two together to give me this in-between colour, and again added a little bit of water to it. So those are the three colours that we're going to use. Right, just going to set the model up. Okay, so I'm going to go in, I'm going to paint basically this little area here, and there's lots of little flat, effectively feathers that are coming out. So of course we already base coated this with Magnetising red, and then we went in with a red wash in the previous videos. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take first of all the base coat, the Magnetising red, and I'm using my 000 brush, quite a small brush because it's quite a small area, and I'm going to basically highlight this up. Each individual sort of feather, I'm going to leave the original Magnetising red with the wash on just at the back of the feather, and that's going to be our little shadow. And then we're just going to basically go in and we're just going to layer on that particular colour. So I'm just going to do that on all of these feathers. Okay, so that is that done with that particular colour. Now the thing to bear in mind, just particularly with red anyway, is when you first layer the paint on, it actually looks quite bright, but as it dries it tends to dull down. It's just a thing with red. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take that mid-tone colour, so that's the two colours added together, and we're going to basically put on another layer. Now this time, last time we probably went about 3/4 of the way up, and this time we're going to go about halfway up. So I'm just going to go on to each feather. It's really difficult on the camera, I'm afraid. I'm doing my best. And we're going to go halfway up, and we're just going to add the next highlight. Because it is such a small area, like I said earlier, you won't actually see any of these layers. It will just look like a highlight. Okay, so that's that done. That's still drying there. Now while it's drying, I'm going to go down to this little purity seal and I'm going to paint that as well. So I'm just literally just going to go around the edge, almost like an edge highlights. So that's the Magnetising red, and I can even go in whilst this is drying with that mid-tone colour. And I'm going to go in with the final highlight. Okay, so that's dry now, so now we're going to go in with that final highlights colour. So we're just going to go in about a quarter the way up. Now don't panic too much if you accidentally go into some of these recesses, because we can always go back in with the wash and just basically line in the recesses, which we probably will have to do anyway, just to add a little bit more shadow to this. So we're going to go in now with the Wild Rider red, which is quite an orangey colour, and we're just going to hit just the very outer areas of the feather. Okay, so that's all highlighted. Now, as I said, I found it really difficult painting on the camera here, and I have actually made a little error. I've gone into the little recess just on this section, which is good because it means I can show you how to correct that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our base coat, the Magnetising red, and using again this very thin brush, I'm just going to line in that recess with this colour, which is how we originally base coated it. So I've lined in that, let that dry, and I'm going to get the wash that we used, the red wash, right at the beginning, and now I'm going to go back over that line with the red wash, so effectively it goes back to how we had it originally. So let's just get that wash, just put that in the recess. And what we can also do, if we want to, is go right at the back of these feathers and just add some more wash to it, just to deepen that down at the back of the feather, just to give us a little bit more shadow. Okay, gonna let that dry and I'll be back. Okay, so that's dry, so now I'm just going to go back in and basically re-highlight that feather. So I'm going to start off with the Magnetising red. And go in with that mixed colour. And then finally with the orange. There you go, all touched up. So that is how layering of small areas works really well. You don't necessarily have to blend all the colours together. You know, they're so small you can't see those different layers, and indeed the different layers sort of almost help make the painting pop. So really hope that was useful to you. Thanks for watching as always, and I shall see you in the next video.